women just generally haven't been brought up to be the breadwinners. I'm a little discouraged just by kind of institutional bias and cultural conditioning.
So what mindset shifts helped you embrace being the breadwinner of your family? Welcome to Everyone's Talking Money, where we get brutally honest about money, mindset, and making life richer. Tiffany, you're a senior executive managing millions of dollars of client wealth. But at home, your husband is the CEO of your household. What is that dynamic like, and how has it evolved over time?
Oh, I love that you say that. I call myself the CEO and he's the COO. I call him our chief operating officer. Yeah, we've got a slightly different setup in that I am the breadwinner of our house, and he's been our stay-at-home parent. Our oldest is now 21, which is crazy to me. So we've got 2 in college, and our son is 8 going on 9. So we've had a pretty busy time, still do. But it's definitely been a very different dynamic than what either of us kind of grew up in.
How did it get to that point? And did it evolve, or was it just like a point in time and you just made that shift?
Yeah. So our story is kind of a long one. We're high school sweethearts, so that we've been together a pretty long time. But obviously, when you're that young and finishing school and figuring out careers and whatnot, it wasn't necessarily the main topic of conversation. Although we talked about, wanting kids and the like. He really grew up with a stay-at-home mom, so he had some very fond memories. My mom had always worked. One of the things I talk a lot about is my own money mindset, and I was always very upfront about that. In that, watching my mom when I was young as a single mom and raising 2 of us and trying to sometimes work 2 jobs and manage the household finances, I kind of always knew. I didn't know this would be my job someday, but I did always know that I wanted my own financial independence. I wanted to make sure that I could make decisions. I could, things have gone well in our relationship, but leave if I needed to leave, change jobs if I needed to change jobs. It just gives you the freedom of a variety of options and choices. So I always knew, for me, the financial side, I wanted to make sure that I felt um, taken care of in that way on my own, that I could always make those decisions. So we've always been pretty communicative in that way. So when it came time and we started having our children, the conversation was, I was really um, coming up in my finance career. I love what I do. I've got a degree in finance and my MBA. So, this has always been really important to me from that perspective. And he knew what it was like to have a stay-at-home parent. So it was not a difficult conversation. I mean, part of it was, do we both work, or does someone stay home? So that's really a big financial conversation in and of itself. But for us, it was like, we don't need the best car. We don't necessarily need the best house. But if I'm going to be working in the city, if I'm going to be commuting, if I'm going to be traveling, how do you get home for sick kids? How do you pick kids up from school? How do you attend all the sporting events? All of the things. So it was just kind of, different for every partnership, but how do we manage that process? So, that was kind of the decision we made early on, and it worked out well for us. But it's been an interesting one.
Well, I mean, there's still a stigma, an outdated stigma around stay-at-home dads. And it's amazing how open and willing and sounds excited that your husband was to take on this role. But especially when mom is the breadwinner, there could be a stigma. So did you ever face some judgment, or subtle or not so subtle, about your family setup?
Absolutely. I think we still probably do at times, right? There's always that judgment out there, but I think part of it is, I'm going to generalize here, but in generalizing that, men have been conditioned to be the breadwinner, so you have to kind of change that mindset, and it's a little bit uncomfortable, and at times can be emasculating, right? Does your partner feel threatened or emasculated in any way? And for him, he's always kind of wanted to be a dad. He's great at being a dad. He can cook. I can't cook. Talking about the conversations about the household chores and all of that. But I think for some, I can tell you, especially like industry events early on in our career when we were much younger, and the kids were babies, right? We're at black tie events, and I think he would say I'm a stay-at-home dad, and people wouldn't know how to react or respond to that. So I think there's part of that, but I think if the two of you in a relationship are having those conversations and you know kind of what each one of you is bringing to the table and you're building and achieving the goals and objectives that we set for each other. It's a partnership. So it's how do we get there and who's going to take on which tasks.
And I think that what's important is that with the conversation, it was like, well, we don't need the biggest house or the best house. We don't need the best cars. We don't need all of these things. And it's the give and the take, right? Because
Correct.
if your husband still did work, there would be other expenses that, families with two working parents would have: daycare, cleaning, maybe cooking, like all these added expenses. So it's important to weigh the financial pros and cons in any decision, whether it's, well, we're both going to work or one of us is going to stay home. And obviously, you coming from a finance background, you can say, like, here's the dollars and cents of it all. And here's why it could make sense financially, but it might make more sense emotionally. So, how did you address that with your kids of, well, daddy's going to be home with you, so he's the default when stuff comes up?
Yeah, I think it's ingrained in them because it's been that way since they were born. So it's for them, it's normalized. Honestly, it was more training the schools, quite frankly, and even sometimes now with our fourth grader, they still call me, and I look at the phone or I'll see it on my watch, and I'll be like, "Why? Like we've been at the same school for 20 years. You know not to call me. I can't answer." Um, so it's that part of it. But I think, to your point earlier on some of the conversations and the discussions and the money we talk a lot about, and I know you do too as well with your clients. But as you're thinking about your longer term goals and objectives and sitting down and looking at your financial plan and your making sure you've got your emergency savings and doing all of those components, I think it's really important. And yeah, I know you've talked about this in some of your past episodes, but being to your point, being a stay-at-home parent, there's costs associated with that. And although there's not a salary per se to your stay-at-home partner, I mean, it's so much added value. And so making sure that when you're doing kind of your overall risk assessment, God forbid we talk about insurance for the working parent, but making sure you've got insurance coverage for your stay-at-home parent, because if something were to happen, replacing kind of all those things they're doing is incredibly expensive. So again, it's that give and take, and it's to your point, do we want to work and pay for some of that outright, or do you need one parent to be at home? So again, it's a family by family decision, of course, but it's a financial one. So I think it has to come into your overall planning conversations.
And it also allows you the ability to give your let you spread your wings, if you will, and really, you're focusing on your career. And that's not as to say you're not focusing on your family, you are, but you're able to have, the other stuff is being taken care of. The phone calls from school generally are going to your husband. Or some of the stuff that takes up so much of a mental load of a mom is being handled. And so how much, and it's hard to quantify, but how much of your career has been positively impacted by not having that invisible mental load on you day to day?
Yeah, a great deal, actually. I think there's always some level, especially when, our daughters were younger. As I mentioned, they're in college now, but when there were two little ones at home and I was working full time, I went back to get my MBA, things like that, things that, were necessary to advance my career and all of that. But at the same time, to your point, there's give and take in each of those. So knowing that they're well taken care of, they're home with dad, they're still making memories, they're doing all the things, like knowing someone that has it covered, I guess alleviates some of that guilt, but there's always a little bit in there.
It's always there,
It's
right?
always
There
there. It's always there. We're caregivers at heart. So there's going to be that tug at the heartstrings. But even as they get older, you having those conversations now with them as young women and young adults, I think is incredible. Telling them kind of our story and how we're from very blue collar families, and how the focus on our financial well-being and their financial well-being and creating opportunities that weren't necessarily available to us I think it's been really, really important. So, in our communication, but our financial communication, I think that's a really critical component for partners.
So, what mindset shifts helped you embrace being the breadwinner of your family without there's going to be guilt, but without total guilt or second guessing?
Yeah, I think I've never really second guessed it, so I think that's it. That mind shift of, wanting to create opportunities. I worked full time and put myself through college as a first generation college graduate. So it was important to me to make sure we were setting aside funds for their education, that they were able to have kind of a different experience than we had. And so knowing we were on track to get there and to provide that for them, I think is just, I don't know, I'm a very task-oriented person, so I love my to-do list, but I know that I've I've achieved this and they're gonna be okay, and we've got here and they're gonna be okay. So I think it's just setting those goals and mindsets. I know we talk about it a lot for clients, but we do that for ourselves as well.
What advice would you give breadwinner women, married or not, in order to manage their money appropriately? And women, we're few and far between in the financial services industry, right? There's not many women. The number is growing, but not we're it's nowhere near equal. But half the population is female. So when females are seeking advice, most of the time men are what's going to end up in their search engine, right? Or may possibly referred to them. And men and women speak a very different language about money. That women have a more emotional, or what is my money going to do for me, and men are, this is the return. This is the
Mhm.
return on investment. And kind of to blend those two together, your investment returns 7%, and that means you have this much money to pay for your child's education, right? So it's like you kind of have to, when you're speaking to a husband and wife, you have to kind of blend both of those languages together so it makes sense for both of them. Because if you're only speaking to one party, the other party, it wouldn't resonate. So, what tips do you have for breadwinner women of finding someone to help them navigate the financial journey that they're on? Because they're making good money, but they may feel like they're not finding the voice that they need to help them.
Yes, I think that's a great question, and it's not always that women seek out women advisors. In some cases, they do, but I think that it's relationship building for anyone seeking an advisor, right? You need to build trust, and that does take some level of time. But finding someone that you can be open and honest and talk with about some of these conversations, I think, you know, um, where women just generally haven't been brought up to be the breadwinners, and I feel like, especially my generation, maybe even a little discouraged just by the kind of institutional bias and cultural conditioning and some of that goes on around us. But I think building our wealth means something very, very different to your point. It's not necessarily about performance, although performance is a big part of that. You want to make sure you understand that. But working with someone who can educate you on what all those different components are, and to your point, what that can mean for you. One of the things I find that works really, really well, and I've had some new clients say, "No one's ever shown it to me that way before," and that feels so good when I hear that. I'm sure you get the same, but, learning how your money is a tool for you and can help you achieve different, goals that you have set. Again, whether that's for us, college for kids, whatever that might look like, whether it's certain dollars for travel, whether it's philanthropy, whether you care about certain types of, investments from an impact, um, mindset, just kind of learning what that means. So working with someone who can really educate you around that, I think is critically important. And I think the education at least still isn't there. I think we're seeing it a little bit better than we were 20 or 30 years ago. But just, again, my daughters in their early 20s didn't get the financial, they from me maybe, but not from schools the way I think they should. And so I think that's part of it is, being curious, asking questions, talking about money and wealth, whether it's with your family or your friends. You don't necessarily always have to talk salary if you're not comfortable with that, but really finding out who other people are talking to or what methods they're using. There's so much out there now with with podcasts such as yours and books and, however you like to absorb that information. I think education is really a critical component of that. And there's so much more than just performance and investments, as we talked about earlier, right? It's the risk management side, making sure you're covered from insurance perspective. And do you have your estate plan in order? And how does all your savings and investment impact you from the tax side of things? So you really want to make sure you're putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, and that can be really overwhelming for a lot of people, especially if you're right. If you're the breadwinner of your family, or even if you're single, as you said, a lot of cases you're still working. You're maybe going back and working on your MBA or other education. There's only so many hours in the day for all of us. So trying to manage it all can be very overwhelming.
How do you help people, or what advice would you give to couples where the 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 woman is the breadwinner, or there's one breadwinner, or there's a big gap in between earnings? How do you help couples navigate that as they're maybe blending finances, or splitting expenses, or starting to live together? How do you help couples navigate that financially but also emotionally?
Yeah, it's interesting. There is no one answer that works for everyone. I feel like, that partners have to figure out what works best for them. I've had some people say, they go all joint accounts all in and they're fine with that. I've had others where they've got kind of joint accounts for operating expenses, but separate accounts on the side. I worked with enough divorce situations over the years that I feel like it's really important for both individuals to make sure they've got some financial independence, especially where you've got maybe one stay-at-home parent in that situation, right? They don't want to feel like they have to come ask for money on a regular basis. So how do you set that up? Really more as a partnership. And that's kind of how I describe it. How do you want this financial partnership to work? And that's where we start the conversation. Because if you're coming together as a couple, as partners, what's that going to look like for the two of you? I say flexibility. You have to be flexible. And I think it's the mindset there is caring for each other. You want the best for each other in the long run. So how do we build that together?
Yeah. So women that are high income earners, what advice or what recommendations do you give them to protect themselves, but also their partners legally and financially when they have a big income gap?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what each partner is coming into the relationship with. So in a lot of cases we do, and what time period that is, but in a lot of cases we talk about prenuptial agreements where those make sense. What are some of those premarital assets? It also depends on what state you live in, right? How the state views what those assets will look like. And in a lot of cases people are moving around. They're not staying in the same place either. So knowing kind of what the state laws are is really important. Um, but I think that's kind of part of it. If there's inherited wealth or other family assets, I think having the conversation when you sit down and look at what your overall net worth is, what your balance sheet is, again, maybe one partner doesn't have access to a 401k. So are you building a retirement account for your significant other? What does that look like? So I think those are all part of the conversations um, that you have to have.
What about if you decide not to get married and you just want to have a partner, and whether you live together, you buy a house together, what are some strategies? I love money. I love talking about money, but I also love talking about reality TV. Those are like my two favorite things. So I learn a lot from reality TV, especially when it comes to money. And well, one, I'm seeing quite a few of my reality TV stars where their husbands are taking a step back, or their partners are taking a step back and allowing the star to expand, whether it's the podcast, they're touring, books, all of this stuff. And then they're taking on the household load, or they're helping them navigate expanding their brand, right? So I'm seeing it's happening more and more. And my husband and I were having this conversation recently that it is happening more and more, and just taking that mental load off, it just allows I believe just allows the woman to dive into her genius and expand it. But I'm also seeing one of my reality TV couples, they were not married. They had a messy breakup, and now like everything's kind of a mess because they mingled so many of their finances with buying a house and all of that. So what is some advice for couples that have no intention on getting married, with merging finances, making big purchases together? How can, again, the breadwinner woman protect herself, but also still be fair to the partner?
Yeah, I think it's a definitely a different situation if you're not going the marital route, and more people are choosing not to, and I think that's okay. So I feel like part of that conversation with your advisor is going to be how best to title those assets. Um, I was working with one couple, for instance, and what can happen if something happens to one of you? Maybe the woman is the breadwinner, the partner doesn't make quite as much money or is taking a step back, but if something happened to her, if not insurance beneficiary, maybe, do you have an account where you've got a transfer on death to help make sure that expenses are covered in the event something happens to her? So there are other ways, if you don't want to necessarily commingle your assets, to just make sure the other partner is taken care of in those situations. And that also kind of protects you on the other side, again, depending on, if there is a split up. So I think commingling when you're not going to be married can be very, very messy. So I think looking at your overall estate plan and how you're titling assets in those situations is going to be really, really important. So I would say for that point, you would absolutely need to talk with an advisor, potentially even an attorney, to make sure you're doing all the right things. But I think that's going to be critical. And more people are choosing either not to get married, to your point, or to get married later. We have more people choosing to rent instead of buying. So, understanding the nuances of all of that's really, really critical.
For families that there's a stay-at-home parent, mom or dad, what are some financial moves they should make in order to make sure the stay-at-home parent is protected? It does have savings, does have, a future retirement. What are some steps to take, really at any point in time for that stay-at-home parent?
Yeah. I think, first and foremost, we talked to kind of all of our couples about making sure they've got the emergency fund set aside, should something happen. I think we talk a lot about insurance, which I mentioned earlier. I think people forget life insurance is critical for stay-at-home parents. You often look at just the worrying about losing the funds from the breadwinner, but again, you can be in a really emotional situation if something happens to your stay-at-home partner, whether that's a disability or a death, and you can only take so much time off work, whatever that looks like. So how do you protect against that? I think insurance is one way to do that. I mentioned already, from a retirement perspective, there are ways to set funds aside in your partner's name if they're a stay-at-home parent, whether that's through some retirement accounts. Um, it's how you title the assets. That's going to be important as well. And making sure, and part of that you both have access to everything. Because I have seen in a lot of cases of death, unfortunately, where, um, and I'm just generalizing here, but maybe the husband kind of took care of a lot of the financials in the home, and the wife is in a situation where she's waiting for statements to come in the mail, or she didn't have access to passwords to get into accounts. I think that's critically important. So we talk a lot about, some people say money dates. I don't know. My husband doesn't consider it money dates. He hates talking about money. So it's dates and money doesn't go with him. But just in general, talking about making sure if something happens to me, do you know where to go? Do you know who to call? Do you know how to access all of the funds that you need? To manage and maintain the household going there. So, I think that's risk management is key, but you have to have those conversations, and you have to have them with each other, but also with your advisor.
So your husband hates talking about money, and you literally talk about it all day,
All day.
all day, every day. Um,
Yes.
how do you approach that? Because that has to be tough for you, because obviously you love talking about money and this is what your life's work is. So how do you approach that? Because it's like, I'm sure you're like, this is all of our stuff. I want to make sure you understand it. You have to know where it is. And is he just like, yeah, you have it taken care of. I'm not worried
Right.
about it.
Thank you for having a portfolio where everything is listed. I know you're taking care of us. I'll be fine. It's kind of how he is. And honestly, when I see couples in that same scenario, I say, okay, but hold on. So I tell them that all the time. I'm like, you're the couple I talk to where you're like, you need to be a little bit more relevant in the conversation. um, because absolutely he's not watching the stock market. He's not looking at the investments. We hear people say it's not my thing. It is of
Yes.
no interest to him. But I say it certainly would be your thing if something happened to me, because you're going to have to step into that role. So again, maybe not doing it day to day, but knowing and having regular conversations about where our accounts are, how they're titled, how you access them, talking about, in general, our goals and objectives and where we are in terms of that. I think those are critical conversations. You don't have to be in the nuts and bolts of it every day, but I think knowing and understanding what you own, how you own it, where it is, how to access it, I think that's the critical part. And we had some of those conversations again when you're talking about insurance needs in general, not just replacing income, but, replacing him if the case may be, but also thinking about when the kids were younger, like, making sure their college was covered if something happened to me, all of those things. So I think that's kind of part of it too, is having regular conversations about, your personal plans and goals and have those changed. And actually they do, right? Things that you have to be flexible because they do change as your life phases change and your kids get older and all those things. So regularly updating those conversations, I think, is just as important.
And does your husband handle the day-to-day household finances and you handle the big stuff? Or do you handle everything because he's just like, I'm not? Because generally speaking, the female in the household handles the day-to-day stuff. Like they know how much is the groceries and some of the bill paying and all of that. And the male will know more of the investments and the mortgage and handle the bigger stuff. So are your roles reversed with that and you handle all the bigger stuff, or do you find that you handle everything?
Our roles are semi reversed, I guess, in that regard. I do say, he's the chief operating officer. So when we hear and read and all of the things that women are making most of the household financial decisions, I'm not. If I go to the grocery store, I have to call and ask him where am I? What am I looking for? What aisle should I be in? Honestly, so we're completely opposite. So he's doing more of the household spending in those terms. So, and I'm kind of more big picture, but yeah, I do more of the bills and the mortgage and all of that too, just because it's what I do. So I'm kind of in the more of the budgeting and day to day weeds, but definitely more of our personal spending and like that all falls on him. Yeah, it's a little bit reversed. Again, it's unique, right? Every family situation is unique, so you have to figure out what works for you. Um, and even if I would, want to say again to even single breadwinners, women out there, figuring out what works for you, what works for your friends, they might give you great ideas, might not be the exact answer for you. So figuring out what that looks like, people use different budgeting software, people use different planning software, people use different advisors. Like all of that is unique to your personal financial situation. There is no other you.
That I completely agree. It's all about having some thought behind it. No matter how
Mhm.
it ends up, at least you had thought behind it and you had a strategy behind it. And what you end up doing can be different than everyone else or other advice that's given, but it works for you. And I'm just speaking, to everyone. It works for you and it works for your situation. So I think that's the biggest mistake people make with their finances, that they don't put any thought into it and they just operate willy-nilly. And as long as there's thought behind it and a strategy behind it, you're already way ahead than most people, because you're putting the thought into it and the consideration, which is super important.
I think that's true. I talk about at least for me, my financial planning process working with people, I talk about kind of the three P's. So I say prepare, plan, and protect. And honestly, the first P in that, the prepare phase is critical. It's understanding where you are today, what you have, how it's titled, what you own, also where you want to be in 1, 3, 5+ years. A lot changes in those timeframes, but to give yourself a guide to follow if you're setting those goals. I know we talk about smart goals, but you need something that's creating steps for you along the way, right? For some people, it's automating. They need that for to help get their emergency fund set up. For some people, it's I need a plan to start paying down student loan debt or credit card debt. So again, it's finding out. It's almost working backwards. Where do you want to be? And then it's what are the steps to help us get there? And those steps are going to be different for everyone. But that prepare phase to me is really, really critical. And then you can put together the written plan. Here's the steps. Here's how we're going to do it. Which is also a big component. But I think that preparation phase, to your point, like understanding your uniqueness and what it is you're trying to accomplish, will help determine what strategies we're going to use throughout the plan to help you get there.
What lessons do you hope your kids take away from watching you be a leader in your career and having your husband lead at home?
Oh, interesting question. I guess I want them to take away from it that, um, there's no specific gender roles, right? That I'd like to take that aspect away. What brings you joy? What makes you happy? What do I don't know. We're only here for a short period of time. So if you're career minded and focused on that, excellent. My husband loves being a stay at home dad. Like, it's his number one thing. Dad is his greatest title. And he embraces that and loves that. I think that's been um, critical for them to see. I think from a financial perspective, I guess I want them to just understand, you know, that money is a tool. What does wealth mean to them and how it can help you build your future? I don't want money to be scary. I mean, it is stressful. We all find money stressful. Even those of us that were in the business, right? Money can be stressful, but it's how you work with it and use it to build that future wealth, and whatever wealth means to you, right? It doesn't mean the same to everyone. I don't necessarily, as we said earlier, it's not necessarily about being the next billionaire, but it allows freedom of choice, of independence, making decisions. Am I able to go ahead and make this job change? And, things like that, where lack of wealth can just be very detrimental on some of those decisions in life. And, you'll have worse, social outcomes, or fewer years of schooling. So just understanding what your financial position and wealth can do for you over time, I think is really important. And I want them to understand that. I also think, especially now looking back, I've raised some pretty strong, amazing, independent young ladies. And
Yeah.
because they've seen our role reversal. So I think that is very, very gratifying. And the other thing I think it's taught them, honestly, is not necessarily on the finance side, but what to expect from a partner in a relationship, and how that support goes both ways, right? And so I couldn't be who I am today or where I am without my husband's support behind me, right? That I want to, with 2 babies at home. I know I'm gone all day, but then I also would like to get my MBA. So not only am I going to be gone all day, but I'm also going to take a couple hours and be gone at night too. Sorry. Plus my travel
How did
schedule.
that conversation go?
And honestly, he didn't bat an eye. And
Wow.
so that's what I mean, like, by the support behind it. Like, if this is what you want to do, we're going to get it done. Like, how do we do that? Because also knowing that that's going to improve our life and our opportunities going forward. So it's a short-term sacrifice for a better future for all of us, right? And that's sometimes hard to see. So I guess I'm lucky that he was always very supportive in that way. Again, blessed.
So, what has been some of the most annoying things people have said to you about being a working mom and your husband being a stay-at-home dad?
I think the hardest thing that annoys me now, honestly, that people ask me, and I don't think they mean it mean, but like, well, now that, you've got 2 in college and 1 in 4th grade, like, now what is he going to do? Like, is he going back to work? Like, first of all, it's not necessarily any of your business. It's for us to figure out. But also, like, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know that I want him to go to work. Right? We still have a fourth grader. He's still got 10 years till he's in school. Like, I sometimes miss sporting events. I can't make all the games. I can't necessarily get to everything, but I know that he'll be there if I
Mhm.
can't. So, if he gets a job and he's gone, then suddenly, like, no one's there to show up at our son's games. I don't think that's necessarily what we want either. So I think that's probably the most annoying thing. Um, but again, it's taken time and years, and from a financial perspective, right? It takes the financial planning, like, how are we going to make this work? What are our steps along the way? So I do it for myself just as I would do it for my clients, I think is part of it.